Hey third graders, welcome to our next Purposes Readers. So we will have two purposes today. One is I can summarize the text, and two is I can identify key details to determine the main idea. Our essential question that we have been working with this week is what ideas can we get from nature? That will help us to identify those key details. What is our to-do? Well, you're going to watch this mini lesson. Then you will read and record your Inspired by Nature text on your Reading Wonders backpack. As you are reading this text and recording it, be thinking about the headings, the key details, and the main idea of the text. Then you will complete your workbook page. You can do that tomorrow. And you're only going to complete one section of your guided reading text. So you're going to pick one section and you are going to put the heading at the top of your graphic organizer. I'll show you how this is done. And you're going to identify the key details and main idea of that section. And then you're going to use that graphic organizer to summarize that section. So let's get started. How do I identify the main idea? Well, we've said this before, and we're going to say it again. In an expository text, use the headings. The headings give you a clue to that overall idea of that section. Once you understand the headings and what the section is going to be about, we're going to use key details in each of those sections. How are we going to identify the key details? We're going to look and see what are the repeated ideas. Those are important. Those repeated ideas are going to give us clues to the sentences we need to identify. Connect the sentences to the headings. Then we will ask, who or what is this section mostly about? And ask ourselves, so what about that subject? So let's review. Last week, we read an expository text about space. And the section that we close read had the heading, Satellites, a Step Closer. So that told us that this section is going to be about satellites and how satellites help us to learn more about space. So as we read, we noticed that satellite kept repeating. That gave us a clue to what sentences were important. So we recorded those details in our graphic organizer. Satellites, that's our who or what. So what about those satellites and that key detail? Take photographs of Earth, the moon, stars, and planets. That connects directly to our heading. Satellites. And how are we getting a step closer? By taking photographs of the Earth, the moon, the stars, and the planets. Our next repeated idea was about satellites. So we recorded that key detail. This key detail also connects to our heading. Satellites collect large amounts of information. So how do we get a step closer? By collecting information. As we read on, we found another repeated idea that gave us a clue to an important key detail. Who or what? Satellites. So what about the satellites? Have tracked temperatures on Saturn. If we go back to that heading, how are we getting a step closer? Well, satellites are giving us information about the temperatures. Okay, so we used our heading. We read looking for repeated ideas. Those repeated ideas gave us a clue to what sentences were important. Then we connected those key details back to that heading. Now we're going to ask ourselves, what do all of these key details have in common? Who or what do all of these details have in common? Satellites. So what about the satellites? The satellites are getting us more information about space. They're getting us a step closer. Satellites teach scientists many things about space. So now we're going to use that familiar text to help us with our new text. Bats did it first. Our essential question that's going to drive our key details is, what ideas can we get from nature? Again, let's think about our purpose. I can summarize the text. I can identify key details to determine the main idea. So your purpose this week, when you read your guided reading text, is to reread one section, identify the key details, and determine the main idea. So we're going to reread this section, How Bats Get Around. That heading gives us a clue to the main idea of this section. Bats get around by... Okay, let's find out how bats get around. The scientist that came up with the ideas for the new cane was inspired by watching bats. He observed the way bats fly at night. The bats make high-pitched sounds that people cannot hear. These sounds create an amazing navigation system for the bats. Here's how it works. So this paragraph, the repeated idea is bats. So what about bats? Bats make high-pitched sounds that people cannot hear. Do we know how those high-pitched sounds help them navigate? Not yet. We have to read on to identify those key details. Let's look for our repeated ideas and our key details that connect to the heading. Bats send sound waves out through their mouth or nose. Okay, here's our repeated subject, bats. Now we have a key detail that shows how bats get around. Send sound waves out through their mouth and their nose. These sound waves hit objects and then bounce back as an echo. So here's another repeated idea, sound waves. So that signals to my brain, this is an important key detail. Let's see if it connects to our heading. These sound waves hit objects and then bounce back as an echo. That is how a bat gets around. The sound waves hit the object and give the bat an echo. The echo tells the bats how far away an object is and how big it is. This information helps bats find bugs to eat. It is also an effective way to keep bats from bumping into trees and other bats. Now that we've just close read this section, How Bats Get Around, we're going to record our key details in our graphic organizer. I am going to label my heading at the top of my graphic organizer, How Bats Get Around. You are going to do the same thing on your graphic organizer this week. Label that heading at the top, okay? We read, the echo tells the bats how far away an object is and how big it is. We read, this information helps bats find bugs to eat. We also read, it is also an effective way to help them avoid hitting trees and other bats. So now we have to determine who or what is this section mostly about? Bats. And now we have to think, so what about those bats? What do all these details have in common? Well, I see the repeated idea of the echo. This information is information from the sound waves. It is also an effective way to help them avoid hitting trees. The it is taking the place of the sound waves. So what about bats? Bats use sound waves to navigate at night. Well, let's develop that main idea in a complete sentence. Bats use sound waves to help them get around at night. And this idea from nature inspired that cane that we read about that helps blind people navigate, that uses sound waves. So we have just identified key details to determine the main idea. So now we're going to use those key details to summarize this section. And this is how we do that. We use the graphic organizer and we retell the section using everything we put together. Bats use sound waves to help them get around at night. They use echoes that tell them how far away objects are and how big they are. That information helps bats to find bugs to eat, and it also helps them avoid hitting trees and other bats. Third grade, we just met both of our purposes. We identified key details to determine the main idea, and then we use that main idea and key details to summarize that section of the text. You are going to do the same thing on your Reading Wonders Backpack graphic organizer. Have fun!